Last night's kickoff of the Republican National Convention had some notable moments from Nikki Haley, Donald Trump Jr., the president himself, and South Carolina Senator Tim Scott.
Senator Scott highlighted the Trump administration's Opportunity Zone program, which aims to move money into low-income communities. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
The next year, I met my mentor, John Moniz, a Chick-fil-A operator. John saw something in me that I could not see in myself and started teaching me valuable life lessons. Like having a job would be a good thing, but creating jobs would be even better. That having an income could change my lifestyle, but creating a profit could change my community. He planted the seeds of what would become Opportunity Zones. This initiative that the president and I worked together on is now bringing more than $75 billion of private sector investment into distressed communities.
Friend of the show and co-host of the Realignment Podcast, Marshall Kosloff, joins us now. Great to see you, Marshall.
Good to see you, Marshall.
Good to see you guys.
Just react to that moment we played in particular and overall Tim Scott's speech last night.
Yeah, so Tim Scott gave one of the best speeches last night. I think we should just address that up front. He was incredibly eloquent. He was also very likable, and he also didn't have some of the weird energy that other speakers sort of had. So I think that definitely worked well. Yeah. But we should take a step back and think about the problem with that overall message, though, which is that he basically gave Jeb Bush's 2015-2016 case just in a far more likable, far better packaged version. And the people that sort of represent this sort of idea, which is the GOP is about markets and charter schools and opportunity and this sort of optimistic message, are sort of missing the deeper point that this message is not something that actually resonates with the base of the GOP. There aren't actual GOP voters right now who are enthusiastic about charter schools, who are enthusiastic about opportunity zones. So I think there's a huge gap there if it's going to leave a vulnerability.
Yeah, and I thought there was actually some interesting analysis here. Matt Iglesias, he talked about, he's like, look, Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, the core problem that they have is that their core economic message is very unpopular. And then a lot of conservatives process Romney's loss as the Democrats smeared the character of a decent man, when what actually happened is that the GOP ran too much of a policy-centric campaign. What do you think of that, Marshall? Do you think that's accurate?
That's accurate. You had the issue with Medicare, Medicaid cuts in 2012. You had the issue of makers and takers, the issue of, 47% of Americans are the ones who aren't on the dole and just sort of want to be entrepreneurs. That message was incredibly ineffective. When people actually saw it, no one actually wants to vote for that. So that's why you sort of saw Republicans do very well in the midterms in 2010. But the second they sort of had to have an affirmative, positive program in 2012, that ran into the Obama buzzsaw. So moving forward, the GOP has to recognize that this agenda itself is not actually popular with voters. It's not popular with moderate voters. It's not popular with the GOP's base. And it's going to be missing something. You can't just sort of run on this economic stuff without the message of cultural aggression that President Trump has.
Yeah.
So let me play devil's advocate here. Does it land with the sort of white, affluent suburbanites who have fled the Republican Party in the Trump era and, showed up in big numbers for Democrats in 2018, the sort of John Kasich wing of the party the Democrats slobbered all over last week at their convention? Because you had two dynamics at play. I mean, first of all, very conventional rhetoric from Nikki Haley, very conventional rhetoric, as we just played from Tim Scott. Sounded like they were getting ready to introduce, Republican nominee Mitt Romney, all of that, right? And you also had a clear emphasis on highlighting some of the more diverse faces of the Republican Party. And this is not aimed really at minority voters. This is aimed at making white suburbanites feel more comfortable voting for Donald Trump. Does that framing and messaging and strategy work at all?
Accurate. I completely agree with that. No one's claiming that Tim Scott doesn't represent a real sizable portion of the Republican Party. It's a coalition, this sort of suburbanite, likes their free markets, likes low taxes. That's a real thing. And that's something that the GOP has to sort of speak to, and their inability to do so in the 2018 midterms was a major issue. But the broader problem here is that base is not enough. This is the coalition that Jeb Bush tried to take to win the nomination in 2015. This is what Marco Rubio tried to sort of do in 2016. And this coalition just does not work. The problem is when you put up this coalition in 2024 against a more culturally aggressive, a more culturally aggrieved Republican who frames himself as, I'm a fighter. Actually, things aren't optimistic in America right now. Our cities are burning. The left is on the assault. We're losing our culture. All those sort of broader critiques. That is always going to win out in a primary over the optimistic message. Where it's not the 1980s. That isn't what's going to resonate with the actual voters who we need to turn out in a primary and the ones you're going to need to turn out in the November election.
So that's another interesting point, Marshall, that we've talked about on the podcast too, which is about how maybe these white suburbanites, Chris, that Tim Scott is meant to reassure, maybe they're just Democrats now. Maybe they're not Republicans and they probably won't be for the future. What do you think?
So it's not that they're not. So it's not that they can't be spoken to. So, for example, I think a lot of those voters are going to vote for Republican candidates in the 2022 midterms if Biden wins. So, for example, if it's about opposition, if it's about, wow, I don't like X, Y, or Z thing that the Democrats have done, that could totally happen. But the broader issue, though, is that in national elections where you're having a national platform and it's even less about local issues, those voters I just don't think are coming back. It's true that they are all for the low taxes. It's true that they like the idea of opportunity zones. They definitely don't want to be seen as racist, but it's just not enough for them, especially when Joe Biden is leaning into, once again, the realignment idea that you and I focus on, that these voters are actually being catered to pretty well by the Democratic Party. That's why Democrats want to make sure if a SALT thing is repealed, aka so that upper middle class voters in high tax blue states could get lower taxes. That's the Democrats who are pushing that. That's why Joe Biden is now saying, I'm not going to raise taxes on people making up to $400,000 a year. He's catering to them pretty well. So it just isn't enough from Scott.
Yeah.
So if you were going to advise the Trump campaign, so you sort of feel like, the voters that a Tim Scott or Nikki Haley is trying to speak to, and that, frankly, last night was kind of schizophrenic because it was sort of half aimed at bringing back these suburbanite voters and half aimed at like the hardcore base of the Republican Party. So if you're going to put off the table like these suburbanites are being catered to well by the Democratic Party, I couldn't agree with you more. They're probably off the table. Where would you go to try to make up the gap that they have right now?
The gap has to lean into the best parts of what Trump's campaign represented in 2015, 2016, which was speaking very clearly to a more working class, more down market America that in a lot of ways isn't very optimistic right now. I think that was the smartest, most unconventional thing Trump did in 2015, which is Trump went around and said, America actually is terrible right now. This isn't an optimistic story. Trump wasn't, Tim Scott had this line in the speech where he said, we're going to have a second American century. That was not Donald Trump's message. Donald Trump's message is that the 20th century was a disaster. We had these bad trade deals. We had these tax policies that didn't work. The GOP is out of touch. DC is corrupt. That is actually much more effective because that actual working class base, that Rust Belt base in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio that Trump has to turn out, they're not feeling optimistic about the countries. They're just not going to resonate with this message of, to quote him, from the cotton fields to Congress. That's a great message, and that really means something. And I'm not attacking that message from a policy perspective, but from a how do you win a national election when you already are losing the popular vote by 3 million votes, when you haven't won a presidential national popular vote in the last 6 out of 7 elections? That's just not enough.
Yeah.
And Marshall, do you think it's harder, though, to have that honest, I would say, assessment of the state of the economy for most Americans when you are the president? So people are like, okay, well, if it sucks, kind of your fault, buddy. This is part of the trap that Obama ran into and Hillary ran into trying to run on Obama's legacy as well. Does he face a bit of a conundrum there? Because part of the coronavirus messaging last night I actually thought was effective, and he's trying to rewrite his early day response, but at least he's recognizing that, okay, this is something that people are taking seriously and we should take seriously. But there was also like a bit of a mission accomplished, look at the stock market aspect to it too. How do you balance these things? How do you square it?
There's an alternate version of the Trump presidency where he came in and just consistently positioned himself as a fighter on these issues. A friend of Sagar and mine said he worked at a Republican super PAC, and his alternate title for Trump's reelection slogan would have been "Finish the Job." So he could have had this idea of, I'm running against this DC establishment. I got into the swamp, and lo and behold, this isn't going to shock any of you, but these people are entrenched. These people are terrible, and dredging the swamp is going to be an 8-year job. That is the case for my presidency. So when Trump leaned into his sort of more free market side and just sort of started touting the stock market as if that was the end all be all, he really sort of missed that opportunity. He missed that opportunity to sort of say, look, down market Americans, anyone who's feeling down, anyone who's sort of experienced deindustrialization or the opioid crisis, I'm going to fight 8 years for you. That would have been an effective message. But no one thinks that Trump won his election in 2016 based on the idea that he was going to help the stock market. Because frankly, President Obama actually did a pretty good job at that sort of issue. That was never sort of the good critique of the Obama presidency, that upper middle class people who were invested in the stock market weren't doing well. That wasn't the problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know what? That's very much what Obama ran on in 2012, and that worked out. Thanks, Marshall. Appreciate it.
Great to see you, Marshall.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. Next on Rising, did Ed Markey get Bernie broed? Friend of the show, Ryan Grimm, he's going to tell us more. That's coming up on Rising.